The hate group, having leveraged the female narcissism for their society of toxic femininity, have actively maximized their studies of the female creature, and to this end, their most notorious of habits, such as their active safari adventures as they stalk down their prey and get to every last minuscule deal, watching as the seasons pass by and that piece of clothing that they want actively degrades in price until finally it, in its most helpless state, can be pounced upon all at once, and then gobbled up and consumed for their viewing pleasure, as the position of its price is irrelevant to the function of whether or not it's still cute as shit, as the kids say. To the extent that this becomes the material reality, the estimates for the obstructions means that all of those similar-minded women might at the same time find the targets, such as David and many of the other essentials to national security people, to exacerbate the extortions for the lowering of the price, that they might have maximum negotiations on the ingestion of its value, as the price that they pay is separate to the continued value of the piece of clothing, which is still the exact same value, and thus obtained at a more favorable price. This being the objective position creates a degree of non-interest, and thus the position of the manipulation of the store in the reduction of its price for a higher extortionary value. And to these ends, you have the mechanisms of the rape culture being approved of by the female narcissists, who, being actively encouraged and validated inside of the spy networks, generate these types of extortions for their relationship options. And to that extent, their disinterest is material interest. And the material interest becomes the function of them doing as they have always. And thus the action of their maximum negotiation from the criminal extortion requires their material disconnection from that for the increase exponentially of the value of that negotiation by the phantom selves who have to be deniable, and thus the action of them pretending to not be using them in order to acquire that value might extort the preferred position, and the function of their negotiation with that phantom self facilitates their cooperation with the rape culture, which then materially uses that structure in order to collapse the sexual market, which then traps and socially engineers the other girls to comply with the rape contracts, which is all a part of the deal and normal procedure of the female narcissist, who, looking out for herself to the highest degree, are again common social dynamics for women. As in the early 20s, the girls form their groups and actively protect each other and subvert and undermine any potential viable option, as they have to do so in order to maximize the value of their sexual market value. And thus the act then degenerates into the function of their complete backstabbing nature in the action when they become older and more desperate for actual relationships. And thus the action of that desperation increases the amount that they would be willing to gossip, subvert, and undermine, and collapse that women of the traveling pants mentality. And thus the use of the extortion exponentially compounds on itself, and thus the action of them using those secret means to engage in the spies maximize the function of allowing themselves to be seen by people, and thus the action of the normal guy assuming that they approached a girl as though it was somehow mysteriously their decision, when in fact the girl had been planning the entire thing the entire time, and thus the action of him being this helpless little deer to be stalked down and cruelly devoured becomes the status quo function of that mentality. And then you give them the unearned powers of the intelligence community to enact this function, materializes the exponential compounding of this activity at the highest degree, and thus the use of the creation of Beauty and the Beast sorceress to create the beast for that extortion materially becomes the status quo expectation, and thus the action of the degrading of the value of their targets facilitates the highest negotiating value by virtue of being the highest potential value on their pedestal, while their target is actively degraded to the highest degree, actively shooing away and scaring off all of the competition so that it can be pounced on at that cheapest price. And then, of course, as all women do, she might fix her man, quote unquote, and thus the action of having broken him in order to heal him materially reacquires the entire value at the cheapest price. And thus the action of her knowing that it's a disguise and the other girls not knowing that it's a disguise gives her the highest value. And thus the retaliation of this, such as for the extortion of that mechanism, then turns into retaliation by X's, and thus the active mechanism of revenge in its permanent cycle, which would be normal behavior for the Confederate anarchist women, who, being functional uh, in that activity, were a bad girl who needs to be spanked, and thus you must punish her, daddy, punish her. And then the smack dipperoo of the dominatrix can then be satisfied. And thus you have the full social engineering, such as the self-hating Jew, who is actively encouraging themselves into the destruction of their group conceptually, and thus designed to be refined into that position, materially compromises themselves to that broken service of their demon lord, and in this expression materially enjoy the concept of fear as a mechanism of sexual arousal, and these types of arrangements culminating in their exchanges that they might form bands and negotiate with other tribal bands and engage in the perpetual assault of their revenge X's, might retaliate in perpetuity, that they might extort every viable morsel of pleasure that could be derived by the action, including the fake betrayal of the agreement, that they might have the satisfaction of the dominatrix sexual exchange, as they have intellectually normalized the rape as a social excitement for the women, and thus the normalization of the rape, and thus the action of the condemnation of anyone that would, by definition, complain about being raped, and thus the action of being raped is then retaliated against the rest of the white supremacist mob from the Confederates in the women's actions, and thus the action of contempt for women, having been derived by men who hate women, is exponentially compounded on by the hatred of women by other women, which then materially supports the structure of the magic, which facilitates the permanent enforcement of that rape culture. Being at that point when it is fully matured, inescapable, and no longer the temporary pleasures derived by sin, but the full realization of its devastations. Now, these types of situations creates a Schrodinger's cat, as some of them are in precedent, and many of them are not. And thus, the action of a minority superimposing itself to look larger than it is can then become intimidating, and thus the action of increasing the function of the contracting of gang stalkers in order to enforce their terrorisms as phantom selves to engage in the white supremacist hate group activities. And thus the action of their magic being enforced by this means any of them would have been planning for an exponential period of time, potentially 3 months or more, to have planned any particular specific example of interactions, having created in their minds their perfect abuse theater with its subcontext and false narrative, enforced by the schemes that they would have arranged covertly. And to this end, you have the completely dead version of the person isn't involved in it, or the completely alive version where they are, and thus you have Schrodinger's cat. And to the end that this is true, all of those engagements, having been fully planned by targets whose social interactions are completely crafted by those systems, might specifically at all times be those types of plans set up specifically designed to subvert them, or they might just be some random person doing whatever, and thus the action creates a complete contradiction of absolute obligation of commitment in order to subvert the narratives being created, and thus the action of the neutrality is neutralized as the person is not neutral but an active alerted threat, and thus the action of that alerted threat creates the active retaliation of the context that they would have been generating for the targets, and thus the action of the harassment for a specific goal requires the party to participate and invest in that party a specific amount in order to not gain the retaliations by the covert operation, and thus the action of contracts by the phantom cells to retaliate against the sign of the person having or not having the action of whatever the contract is in the enforcement of the white supremacist communism, such as the social engineering and the economic engineering, etc., creates the position of those obligations to exist or the retaliation would be enforced, and thus the action of having to engage with particular people and not being able to engage in other particular people unless retaliations that aren't specifically known will actively be enforced, such as the position of David's obligation to engage in the drunk notes of the War on David channels, which facilitates the foundational pretext of the Revenge X's channels, which would then be compelled to make the full stories, which would then trigger the gang stalkers to signal a non-action, and thus the action of them not enforcing the terrorism from their hate crimes in the action that they've observed X, Y, or Z. And to the extent that this becomes a material threat in active danger, then this supersedes the function as an ongoing active threat to engage in the actions which would otherwise seem abnormal without the threat's existence, which then acquires commonly as the design the negative reaction from other people surrounding that person or that person directly, and thus the action of the negative reaction of the social defamation or other injury with the material payment as a service to the people who set it up, and thus the action of the person not wanting the thing has to retaliate or not pay for the thing cannot, in this action, engage in the retaliation against the party being targeted, lest the funding by the payment of the retaliation serve the objective of those who were doing the trick, such as the function of Ashton Kutcher's show, where he was actively harassing people in order to play public pranks or some variation of it. And thus the action of the public prank, but it's not actually a prank, it's an active terrorist hate group enforcing hate crimes against the general public. And thus the action of those defamations from their smear factory engages in the perpetration, and thus is actively accelerated and encouraged by the action of the retaliation in a non-benign way, and thus the action, having acquired the exchanges of services, funds the service of having conducted the harassment, and the action of having conducted the harassment increases the amount of harassment distributed to the general public, and thus the position of those who are being harassed as a reaction to that function would have to not retaliate in that specific example, which requires them to have known or to have not known, which generates the confusion, increasing the likelihood of the retaliation funding service, which funded the creation of the harassment of the childish games derived by the terrorists engaging in the hate crimes, which requires a unification of the two parties who are being harassed to join forces against that party in order to stop the funding of the harassment or those parties in the harassment section, such as the ones contracted by Lindsey Graham for the white supremacist arrangement of overthrowing the United States government to engage in the permanent destruction of society, would have to maintain those functions in their unison against that funding, materially engaging in the counteraction, as they have arbitrarily been targeted by the hate group to be harassed in perpetuity upon checkpoints, and thus the action of their terrorist schedule for harassment is similar to the function of the NSA's position of the FISA, which targets foreign parties in their engagement of any particular action against Americans, who then might be connected to those parties, who then create a backdoor to stalk those people, and then the people that they know, and the people that they know, encompassing the entirety of the United States, requiring, as a retaliation, every civilian to specifically become xenophobic and racist against all foreign people, lest they, in the backdoor action, might be consumed. And thus the retaliation of the terrorist violence by those hate group contracts might similarly have that fake excuse. And thus the action of, even if it would not be true, then it becomes de facto reality that they would be targeted under that same system of backdoors, even if they had fully cut off every variation of those backdoors, which the person would have to know in violation the parties in question that they would be getting backdoored into in order to stop being backdoored into that position, which creates the contradiction, which creates the position of their ability to make the argument, which would then be nullified by the action of them being capable of making the argument, which by definition means that they have the information to be backdoored. And thus the action of the harassment on an indefinite capacity materializes the perpetual collapse of society and its base laws in favor of the white supremacist anarchy. So you understand the position of their messing with the enemy military operations being used against the United States in unofficial acts, and thus the action of the corruption compounding infinitely creates the viability of the rape culture by the pedophile network who have infiltrated the United States, who have protected themselves by the anarchy, barring their ability to be prosecuted by their double agents who have blocked all forms of remedies to Confederate actions or quote unquote secrets. And thus the action of a pedophile judge in the East Coast actively stalking children would then be countered by them coming up with some system, which would then be retaliated by creating some scam, creating thought experiment strategies on the West Coast, disconnected from them, in order to create counter strategies to that action, facilitating the access of the pedophile judge to them, who, having used that strategy, would have defeated the mechanism, such as, but it's not limited to, the function of the surveillance harassment, being capable of engaging in the function of women accepting the precedent as a collective structure, which would then materialize the breaking of the defense mechanism as the keys to Troy, and thus the action of the Trojan horse getting inside of the walls materially creates a permanent vulnerability, such as, but is not limited to, the use of the surveillance to stalk those children into their bedrooms. And now you have a pedophile creep in an 8-year-old's room because she is quote unquote cute and shit, as well as the pedophile rackets conducted by the sheriffs in Florida who are actively protecting these systems, as well as throughout the United States, as the white supremacists have infected and spread throughout the system, freely exchanging in the entire arrangements, materially protected by the white supremacist Confederacy mechanisms, which then prevent their prosecution, such as, but is not limited to, the pedophile doctor in Texas who had managed the gymnast, and thus the action of their retaliation being against the will of the government in every way required the extreme outrage of the general public, including the use of child porn in order to prove that he was guilty, which later, after the creation of the policy to retaliate against them, can then have them arrested for having the possession of the evidence in question, which would have forced the government to retaliate them, criminalizing the evidence, that they might permanently be disadvantaged, as the Trojan horse and thus all of its forces are inside of the walls, making a permanent, inescapable vulnerability to every possible target or victim that they might desire.